Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Hippias Major, the preamble. The first dialogue that we read through in this podcast series was Hippias Minor, and Hippias Minor is so called because it is the shorter dialogue of two dialogues with the interlocutor Hippias. The longer dialogue is Hippias Major, and I've been asked why I hadn't read through that one after Hippias Minor. The fact is that I have written an analysis of Hippias Major. In fact, I wrote it over 30 years ago, and perhaps it would be a good idea just to summarize what I said there and possibly update it a little bit, because at the time I hadn't made any distinction between paradigmata and degmata. I treated all of the characters then, eventually, once I found out what was going on, as models of aspects of an idea. One drawback of treating the characters as models only and not as degmata of paradigmata is that it could still be argued that Plato has drawn from the historical characters, while in fact he has drawn from the aspects of an idea themselves, and the aspects are represented by paradigmata, which he has then fleshed out with details from historical figures, which means that Socrates is not Socrates the historical figure, but has some features of Socrates the historical figure. It is basically the paradigm with additional details. This explains why the characters are so extreme and clear-cut, as we will see. In the 80s, when I wrote my analysis, a debate was still raging over the authenticity of the dialogue. Half of the scholars thought that the dialogue was unworthy of Plato. It had too many comedic elements in it. Socrates was far too aggressive against Hippias, while Hippias himself was made to look a bit stupid. On the other side, those supporting authenticity argued that the dialogue is a dialogue and style may change from dialogue to dialogue depending who is participating in it. But beyond that, they didn't have much of a case because the philosophical arguments are totally absurd. It seemed to me that it was rather pointless to argue for or against authenticity when the dialogue itself hadn't been fully understood, which is why I decided to analyze the dialogue without asking the question, who wrote the dialogue? Today, after my analysis of that dialogue and a few other dialogues, it does seem to me that this is authentic. Plato wrote it, and I also think this is one of the most important dialogues because it is the only dialogue in which we get a full account of the good itself, which is often talked about in other dialogues but isn't actually defined in any of them. I'm not saying it is defined in this dialogue, but the analysis of this dialogue actually allows us to reach a definition of the good. The actual subject of this dialogue is to kalon, which may be translated as the beautiful, but may be better translated as the fine, which has a better overlap with the good, which is very closely connected with it. There are 7 attempts to answer the question, τι εστι το καλόν, what is the fine, and they are all refuted. If this were all we had of the dialogue, we wouldn't know how serious Plato was about this purportedly philosophical conversation, it seems to be completely absurd, but how would we know? Perhaps Plato thought it was serious. Luckily, he's given us an entire conversation before this, which is not about anything philosophical or abstruse. It's actually about very familiar concepts in Greek culture. And we can see from that conversation, about a fifth of the whole dialogue, how Socrates and Hippias both operate. And then we are in a better position to see what happens in the supposedly philosophical conversation afterwards. An important point, made clear only halfway through the dialogue, is that Socrates and Hippias are alone, completely alone. And this is extremely significant, but we'll return to this point later. Hippias of Elis in the Peloponnese has just arrived in Athens, and he explains to Socrates why he has been absent for so long. It's because the citizens of his polis sent him frequently and on the most important missions to Sparta, and that's why he has been absent for so long. Socrates appears to be impressed by this, but gradually, during the interchange between them, he adds more and more the idea that it's good to make money as a sophist. Hippias portrays himself as having earned more money from teaching than any two other sophists, and Socrates concludes that this is the mark of Sophia, to earn the most money. As we've already discussed in the past, Sophia is not so much wisdom as expertise. Given that the expertise of a sophist is manifested in the amount of money he earns from teaching when he's on one of his visits to cities, Socrates concludes that obviously Hippias makes most of his money in Sparta on all of those trips he was boasting about earlier. But strangely enough, Hippias doesn't. He makes absolutely no money on his trips to Sparta, and Socrates is perplexed. Well, how so? Why don't you make money in Sparta? And then Hippias has to tell him something that all Greeks knew, that the Spartans don't pay for foreign education. He's just not allowed to make money there. But, he says, you should know that if they did allow it, I would make most money. And then Socrates says, so what you're saying is that the Spartans break the law in that they don't pay you money. They should pay you money, but they don't. And Hippias agrees with him. And this is a very important point. At every step of the way, whatever it is that Socrates appears to think is a criterion for Sophia, Hippias adopts it. Whatever Socrates thinks, Hippias will adopt it in order, of course, to appear sophos to Socrates. And this is where it's so important to know that they are alone. There are no other people around who would point out that what they are saying is absurd. The Spartans are far from lawbreakers. They obey the law far too much. And notice that Hippias is prepared to accept that they are lawbreakers when just a few moments ago he was proudly saying that he was appointed on the most important missions to Sparta. So what is going on here? Hippias is adapting his position to conform to the opinion or the apparent opinion of his audience, which in this case is only Socrates. And that's very unfortunate for Hippias, because Socrates is not his usual type of audience. Socrates is not one of the many. Socrates obviously is a dialectician. Why at the very beginning was Hippias so happy to say that he was appointed to visit Sparta on the most important missions and the most frequent missions? It's because Socrates had begun the dialogue altogether by saying, Hippias ho kolostikai sophos, Hippias the fine and expert. Socrates then observes that Hippias hasn't been in Athens for a very long time. This allows Hippias to say that he is indeed kolostikai sophos, because he's always being chosen to represent his city on important embassies, especially to Sparta. Socrates then spends an inordinately long time setting up what appears to be an elaborate trap, which at the end has Hippias looking like an idiot in Sparta, because that is precisely the place where he doesn't make any money teaching as a sophist, exploiting his visits to foreign polis. According to Socrates' new explicit criterion of Sophia, Hippias should have thought that he has failed in his attempt to impress his audience, because his audience clearly thinks that the sophos is a sophist who exploits embassies to make the most money in teaching, while Hippias makes no money at all on his embassies to Sparta. Clearly, Socrates is attempting to undermine Hippias' confidence in his ability to adapt himself consistently to the opinions of his audience in order to appear to them to be sophos. It's also worth noting that during the great movement from the first to the opposing second criterion of Sophia, Socrates also makes a few other attempts to undermine Hippias' ideas about reputation by talking about legendary characters who had an unshakable reputation, which Socrates seems to know nothing about. He allows Hippias to appear greater than them, but Hippias doesn't realize how bad that is, because it means his own reputation is just as unstable. Reputation and appearance in general all depends upon one's audience, and we'll take a closer look at audiences next time.